Hi guys, my name's Mr. Lead, and today I'm going to be explaining how you build a camera. More specifically, how to build a pinhole camera. I built my pinhole camera like this. It's out of a classic shapes box. As well as explaining how to build a pinhole camera, I'm also going to be explaining how a camera works.
What you've got to understand is that cameras work very similar to human eyes. Our human eye has a lens in it, and that lens has the job of bending light down a certain way so that light is projected at the back of our retina. A camera also has a lens, and the lens is also bending light to be projected onto some film. Pinhole camera like this doesn't have a lens on it. All it has is one tiny little hole. So how can a hole work the same way as a lens? I'd assume that if you had one hole in a wall, it would only show one little beam of light to project one little spot on a back wall. But to assume that, you would be thinking that light is only traveling horizontally, when it's not. Sometimes we see light that is reflected diagonally. And if this diagonal light manages to make its way through the hole, we'll see more than just one little spot of light. We'll see a full picture of whatever is being reflected projected on the back of the room or the chamber or the pinhole camera. That's how a pinhole can have the same effect as a lens. With a lens, you're trying to divert all that light down to a single point to be reflected onto a surface. But with a pinhole, you're already limiting that light down to a certain point, and that light is traveling through that certain point at different angles. The effect of projecting an image onto the back of a wall using a pinhole is called a pinhole image. This effect has been known for thousands of years. It was known as camera obscura, which is Latin for dark chamber. That's where the term camera comes from. So we can see this effect even in buildings, as long as you have a tiny hole and as long as the distance between the hole and the back wall is at the right amount, you can see a projected image onto that surface. The image appears upside down because the light that was at the top of the image here, the light that was at the top of the object here has ended up down at the bottom of the surface, whereas the light that was originally at the bottom of the object here has ended up at the top of the surface. The first cameras that were made were pinhole cameras. They looked something like this. You would have a pinhole at the front and you'd put a piece of film at the back, and the light would be projected in, and they would come through the hole and it'd be projected onto that film, and the light would chemically react with the film so that the film showed an image. This here is what's known as a brownie box camera. It was one of the first cameras publicly released for the everyday person to be able to buy and use. But a brownie box camera actually isn't quite a pinhole camera because it did have a little tiny lens, and over time the lenses got bigger and bigger. There's an advantage. I'll explain why lenses are an advantage to small pinholes. But yeah, the first cameras were just pinhole cameras, and pinhole cameras can actually produce some decent photos. If you put in some photographic film into the pinhole cameras that you make, you can actually produce some good pictures.
Okay, so how is it that you make a pinhole camera? Firstly, you must understand that a pinhole camera is just basically a box with a tiny hole in the front. I've poked into some aluminium foil here, and on the back, instead of having film, you can put photographic film into your box and have a picture that you can keep forever. But in this case, I don't have photographic film, so I've just got baking paper. You can use wax paper as well, that's usually better. So this does not project a picture that will remain there. You can't keep a picture forever, but you can still see the effects of the camera. So the basic materials you're going to need is a ruler, some tape. You'll need something to poke the hole, so a toothpick or a pin, scissors, baking paper, aluminium foil, and a box. Now there is actually an ideal size you should have your box be, and an ideal size for how big your hole should be. And also an ideal size for how big the either window of baking paper or film should be. And that's This is one of the many ideal sizes here. I'm going to explain later why there's an ideal size and what dimensions of camera influence that. But note that you can really use any size box, and as long as you use your camera in a certain way, you can get to see the effect work. One other thing you're going to need is a blanket. Okay, first, just double check to see if your box is actually the ideal size. If it's not, that's okay. Mine definitely isn't. Like I said, you can still get your camera to work anyway. Next, what you're going to need to do is you'll need to cut 2 windows on either side of your box. One window you're going to put aluminium foil over, and the other one you're going to put the baking paper over. Alright, there's one of my windows. My box was actually really falling apart, so I could only cut a window just as big as the box itself. That will be my window for the baking paper. If you'll see on my last box, I actually didn't cut a window as big as the box itself. I made it actually more like a window. And try to do that if you can. Okay, so with the baking paper, make sure when you're taping it on, don't scrunch it. You don't want it to be scrunched, otherwise that's going to wreck the image. Alright, so I'll cut out a piece that's the right size. There we go. And then tape it on. Trying to make sure this baking paper is as flat as possible. So the reason why we don't just poke our pinhole in the cardboard of the box itself and we instead get some aluminium to put and use for our hole is because you can actually make such a more finer and smooth hole with the aluminium. And that's really important when you want to get the light let through at just the right way. Therefore, it's extra crucial that the aluminium foil I use for my hole is really smooth foil, not the rough foil that you'd probably see at the start of a roll. So, cut your piece and stick it on. Now, you'll notice with aluminium foil is that one side is actually more reflective than the other. You want to, when you're taping this on, you want to actually make sure that the more reflective side is facing out from the box. You don't want the reflective side inside the box. Okay, so now we've got to pin the hole into it. Now, when you're pinning this hole in, you want to be very, very clean with this. The hole that was made in this old pinhole camera has now ripped apart a bit, and that's not what you want. You want a really clean, round hole. And ideally, you don't even want it as big as this. So, I'll show you how I'm going to do this one. Just one little poke. I'm going to twist it round a bit, and then pull it out. And there you have it. Now, remember, there is an ideal size that your hole should be, depending on how long your box is and how wide your window is. So, we're going to test this box, see if this hole works in the way it does, and if it doesn't, we might need to make the hole just a little bit bigger. Okay, so right now, you can't see any image being projected onto the baking paper. That's because not only do we have light coming in from the hole and being projected on the baking paper, we've also got light coming on from this side on the baking paper, and that's mucking up what we'd hopefully see as the image. So to eliminate the light coming in on this side, we need to view this camera from underneath a blanket. You might have seen pictures of old-fashioned photographers actually do the exact same thing when they were taking photos with their cameras. So we need a view like this. Alright, so I'm seeing a very, very faint image here being projected onto the baking paper. But maybe I need to make the hole just a little bit bigger so that it's a little clearer. I'm going to use this toothpick just to widen the hole a bit. There we go. Might have widened it too much, but we'll still see an image. Now we're starting to see a much clearer outline of the image the camera is capturing. What this outline is of, it's just of my back window with the chair there. You would see that the image is actually upside down in the camera, because remember, images always appear upside down. Cameras nowadays know how to flip that image the right way around, just like how our brains know how to flip the image projected onto our retina the right way around. Make sure whatever subject you're trying to capture is backed with some really, really bright light. So here I've got daylight that's really, really bright, and that's making the image in my camera appear very well. Now in this case, I have a person standing in front of the window, and you can see their image clearly on the camera. But if you're in a room that's not quite as bright or a bit more dimly lit, you're not really going to see any image from the camera because not enough light is passing through the pinhole.
We're getting images projected on in these cameras, but they're not as clear as the images we're seeing here. And there's a couple of reasons why. The first one is because the images here are made using photographic paper, and that photographic paper is way more sensitive than baking paper. The second reason is because the cameras I've got here, I didn't paint them black, and that's something you can do with your pinhole camera if you've got time. You can paint your pinhole camera black to be much so that the image is much more sharp and crisp. The reason why painting the camera black helps is because black surfaces absorb light, while white surfaces, like the inside of this box, reflects light. And so if you see light being reflected, this is what it'll look like. Here we go. You see that with a white surface, you're seeing all the light being bounced around and reflected everywhere within a white box. And so that means you're getting too much light reflected onto the film. Whereas with a black box, that the black insides are absorbing that light, and you're getting just the right amount of light projected onto that film. And so the final reason why we're not getting a very clear picture with our camera here is because, like I said before, our camera is not the ideal size. To understand what makes a camera the ideal size, or what makes a pinhole camera the ideal size, we need to understand some basic dimensions of how a camera works. We need to understand about aperture, shutter speed, and the focal length. Shutter speed refers to how much light are you letting in onto an image. So if you know with a camera, you'll hear a camera click. That click is the camera opening up its lens and then suddenly closing it. So the camera will only let in a certain amount of light in. If the camera lens is open for a longer period of time, it's letting in more light. Now, shutter speed will affect the brightness, because how much light comes in means that your image is going to be brighter. And shutter speed will also affect motion blur. And this makes sense because if you're letting more light in, that's kind of just the same idea as throwing more paint at a page. It's going to be a little bit more blurry if you're letting more paint being thrown at a page. Likewise, the same for if you're throwing more light at a film. In terms of a pinhole camera, the first pinhole cameras that were actually used as real cameras with photographic paper, depending on the sensitivity of your film, you need to leave the lens open anywhere between 30 seconds to 2 hours. And so that means that a subject had to remain still in front of a pinhole camera for 2 hours. Otherwise, the image will become blurry. Now, in our case, this pinhole camera does not use photographic paper, it just uses baking paper, which is why shutter speed doesn't matter. This next element does matter, though. This is aperture. Aperture refers to the size of your hole. And the size of your hole affects two things. It affects the depth of field, which basically just means what part of your subject is in focus. And aperture also affects the brightness of your image. So if you have a really wide hole, that will have a very low depth of field. But if you have a really small hole, that will have a very far depth of field. So to explain this in terms of the properties of light, you've got to think about the way light travels here. So here's an image or a diagram of Wikipedia that might slightly help you if you looked at it. But I'll explain it further with this diagram here. Each of these lines here represent the path that a beam of light travels from one single point. So from this one single point on this mousse here, we're seeing light traveling in this way, and it'll be traveling this way, this way, this way, all the way down to this way, and it'll keep traveling outwards. But this is the furthest reach that our camera aperture can see. The wider the hole is, when you have objects that are closer, they'll have a much easier time at redirecting themselves back to a single point on the film. But the light that is coming from this single point on the mousse has a harder time being redirected back into a single point, and instead we're seeing this point being much fuzzier and blurrier. You need a smaller hole to recorrect this error. The benefit of having a tiny pinhole is that you'll only direct small amounts of light being reflected off certain points onto the back image. So that means that your image is going to be much more crisp. But we did first try this pinhole camera with a tiny, tiny pinhole, and it wasn't giving a very clear image. And that's because there's a downside to having a pinhole camera like this. And that's because the smaller the hole you have, the darker your image is going to be. Aperture also affects how much light is let into the image. It affects the exposure. If you've got a really large aperture, that's going to be highly exposed. Really small aperture, low exposed. So even though it will be really clear, it will not be very bright. By the way, our eyes actually work in just the exact same way. Our pupils will dilate and contract to let certain amounts of light in. If we want to see things that are really close up, our pupils will dilate, and that's good for darkness. But when we need to see further away, have a very far depth of field, our pupils will close up a lot more, so that we can see further away objects. And they'll also close up when when we're in a really bright room as well. Anyway, so for pinhole cameras, there is a fine balance with the size of the hole. You don't want it too small because then it'll be too dark, but you also don't want it too big because otherwise it will make the light blur the image. However, there is one other element that will affect how blurry the image is, and that is the focal length. You see, if you had two boxes with the exact same size hole, but the boxes themselves were different lengths, that's going to affect how clear your image is. Focal length refers to the distance between the lens and the film. So if the lens is right here and the film's here, this box has a larger focal length than this box. Now, focal length affects two factors. It will affect the field of view, which means how wide your shot is or how zoomed in your shot is, and it will also affect the depth of field, just like the aperture, which part is in focus. So we can see here in this case, the longer your focal length is, so 16 millimeters, 35 millimeters, all the way up to 200 millimeters, we get a much more narrower field of view. In this one, we can see right from this side to this side, but in this one, we're not seeing as wide an image, but we are seeing more zoomed in. So that's what field of view refers to. You can see lots of different cameras will have very different length lenses, and that's because they all have different focal lengths. If you have a very long lens, i.e. long focal length, like I said, you'll have a very narrow field of view. It'll be very zoomed in, but you're also going to have a very shallow depth of field, meaning that you can only focus on one certain part at a time. You can't focus on both what's far away and close up at the same time. Whereas if you have a very small focal length, so usually a wide angle lens, you'll have a very wide field of view, and you'll have a very large depth of field, meaning everything is going to look a lot more focused. You can see the focal lengths being used a lot in something called the telephoto effect. So in this photo, the woman here is being taken with a wide angle lens, a very short focal length. And because it's got a short focal length, that means the field of view is very wide. You can see this building all the way to this building. So this is probably the lens that's being used for this photo. But because it's a shorter focal length, that means that the depth of view, so the part that's in focus, is there's a very large depth of view. We can see all the back buildings are in focus and she's in focus. But in this photo, the woman's standing in the exact same spot, but it looks completely different. Firstly, the cameraman had to move back just so we could know that, just so he could zoom in on the woman and make sure that she appeared the same size in both photos. But here we have a very narrow field of view because we're only seeing like from this tree to this building here, which is probably like from there to there. We can't even see it much from this field of view. And the depth of field is very shallow. We only get to focus on one part at a time. We can only focus on the woman, or we can focus on the background. So when you have a very long focal lens, you're not going to be able to focus on everything all at once. So if a cameraman is using a camera with a long focal length, he has to make up for that by standing in the right position so that he can focus on the object in the right way. So to make your image in your pinhole camera less blurry and to get the sharpness right, you need to understand this fine balance between the aperture size, the hole size, and the focal length. So if you don't get this balance right, if you don't get this right ratio, then that means you're going to have to focus on an object at the right distance and try and find what what distance you are from that object you need to be. And so that's why this supposed ideal size works really well, because it is the right ratio between the aperture size and focal length to have a sharp image.
If you want though, you can actually make a camera that has an adjustable focal length. I'm going to do this by using two toilet paper rolls, with one being slightly wider than the other, so one can actually fit in the other. So I've got my baking paper on one, my aluminium foil on the other. I put the baking paper one into the aluminium foil one, like so. And now, while you're even looking down the camera, you can adjust the focal length. The focal length, remember, being the distance between the lens or the pinhole and the film or the baking paper. The benefit of this camera here is that I don't need to go under a blanket to use it, because there's no light being exposed to the film in here, or there won't be as soon as I put my eye to it. So you can see we can adjust the focal length to adjust the clarity of the picture. It adjusts, meaning it adjusts the depth of field, and it also adjusts how zoomed in the picture is, meaning it adjusts the field of view.
That's how you build a pinhole camera, and that's how these different dimensions of a camera works. I hope you probably learnt something. A good photographer is someone who knows how to use all of these different dimensions and is really well practiced in them, and knows what settings they would need to adjust their camera to, and how to tinker with these dimensions to take the perfect shot in any situation. There are a few other dimensions I didn't mention. For one, photographers like to adjust the amount of light they're playing around with. That's why cameras have flash. Of course, if you're letting more light in, that's going to mean your picture is a lot more exposed and brighter and colorful. And there's another dimension entirely. I've been talking this entire time as assuming you're using pinhole cameras or cameras with film. But nowadays we have digital cameras, and a digital camera doesn't use film. Instead, light comes in and it reacts with sensors, and the sensors then convert what they see into information, which is then converted into pixels. And how sensitive the sensors are is known as ISO. And so ISO is a whole nother dimension that you need to play around with if you need to be knowledgeable with cameras. But yeah, that is how cameras work. That's how you build a pinhole camera. I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.